From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Donald Trump is coming for Canada.
Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, and you take a look at what that looks like, and it would also be much better for national security. Don't forget, we basically protect Canada. But here's the problem with Canada. We're spending hundreds of billions a year to protect it. We don't need their cars. I'd rather make them in Detroit. We don't need their lumber. We have massive fields of lumber. We don't need anything they have. So why are we losing $200 billion a year and more to protect Canada? They should be a state.
He says the border is artificial, that Canada should join the US as its 51st state, and is beating them around the face with trade tariffs to drive home the point. Canada's new Prime Minister, however, isn't having any of it.
We didn't ask for this fight, but Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans, they should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win.
So I just got back from Ottawa, and then I traveled around the capital and then went down to the border crossing with New York State to talk to some of the tens of thousands of Canadians that make this commute across the border to America every day for work. And they talked a little bit about this kind of subtle cultural shift at play, basically expressed this idea that for so long their national identity has just been not American, and now they're kind of grappling with who they are outside of that.
As Prime Minister Mark Carney uses his first week in office to visit France and the UK, Canada's reliable allies, he says, we'll ask what has driven this wedge between the North American neighbours and what Canada and its allies like us might do about it. The story today, the 51st state fights back.
I'm Josie Ensor, the US and sometime Canada correspondent for The Times and Sunday Times.
Let's get into this argument and how it's brewed between the two countries. This sort of started with the threat of trade tariffs, which we'll get into in a minute, but it quite quickly turned into quite a shocking barrage from the US president on Canada, claiming it would soon be the 51st state, referring to Justin Trudeau, the then Prime Minister, as governor.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state. We give them protection, military protection.
How did that all come about, and what did you make of that?
It's not often talked about, but Trump actually first suggested this idea of making Canada the 51st state in 2016 during his presidential campaign. I mean, back then people laughed. It was taken as rhetorical rather than any kind of expression of serious political intent. He then revived this idea, this bizarre idea of the 51st state with Trudeau, the former prime minister, at a lunch in Mar-a-Lago in November over Thanksgiving weekend. He said Trudeau would make a good governor of this 51st state and that, the former PM just sort of laughed it off, I think. But, in the last few months, however, Trudeau and now Mark Carney have privately been briefing that they need to be taking him much more seriously.
And how much anger has there been amongst Canadians at this suggestion?
Well, there's been a real swell in patriotism. I think a lot like Brits, Canadians feel very uncomfortable with this kind of jingoism, but it's really united Canadians over the last few weeks. So it kind of started at these ice hockey games, which are obviously normally very friendly between neighbours and allies, with Canadians booing the US national anthem. it's now extended to the buying of Canadian products over American, boycotting Californian wine and Tennessee whiskey, and no longer watching Netflix. And sadly, Canadians have discovered their favourite fizzy drink, Canada Dry, is actually American-made.
Twist.
Shock horror. And, a Quebec travel agency told me that half or 50% of those who'd booked holidays already to the US had cancelled. So there's the seriousness and there's also the light, around Ottawa baristas have renamed the Americano, the Canadiano, and it's become the most popular drink. So it's really roused a kind of unexpected Canadian patriotism.
Did you sense anger mixed in with that? Calling it a Canadiano, whatever it was, instead of Americano is quite a sort of good gag. But did you sense like genuine frustration at this?
It's a mixture of sadness and anger. I mean, people are genuinely sad. It's sort of like finding out that your big brother or your best friend didn't actually like you as much as they thought they did. I mean, this was a relationship, an alliance that they'd long just taken for granted as being strong and able to weather whatever president or prime minister took charge, but it's been a really testing few weeks for them.
Because it's one thing for us in the UK to bang on about the special relationship with the US, but just explain for us in terms of the relationship between Canada and the United States, how close that is in terms of, trade and intelligence and, even just the big border they've got between the two of them.
I mean, they're so interlinked. Everything is set up for this alliance to work. So, not only do you have the energy running from the north to the south of the continent, you have the Five Eyes of intelligence sharing, you've got the longest undefended border in the world, and vital trade and security and intelligence. And for Canadians, it's deeply upsetting to be treated as enemies for the first time since the War of 1812.
And for all the rhetoric, I guess the bit that might actually affect Canadians and Americans most in this battle is what's afoot in terms of trade. These tariffs levelled by Donald Trump and the reciprocal ones which the Canadians have threatened and put in place in return have flip-flopped all over the place. Explain for us how that grew and where we are at the moment with all of that.
Yeah, so shortly after Trump's inauguration, he initially imposed these tariffs on the closest trade partners, so Canada, Mexico, as part of the America First trade policy. His rationale for these tariffs, particularly on steel and aluminium, were to protect US industries. He argued that both countries had engaged in kind of unfair trade practices that hurt US manufacturers, and that both of them were kind of not staunching the flow of undocumented migrants to America. There was this kind of trade in fentanyl. Obviously, to some extent with Mexico, that was true. But, if you look at the kind of minuscule amounts of fentanyl coming through Canada, he then gave Mexico a reprieve and he continued to impose them on Canada. And then things really ratcheted up. I mean, Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs on something like $20 billion of US goods. What's been interesting to watch is in Ontario, one of the biggest GDPs of Canada, the Prime Minister has started threatening electricity blackouts across some of the US border states. Here I am in New York waiting for my lights to get cut off. I mean, that's where we are at the moment.
And in terms of the balance between the two, if this does continue, for all these retaliatory threats from Canada, they would be most likely to lose out, wouldn't they? If this relationship completely fell apart on the trade front.
Yes, of course. I mean, Canada was vaulted to the G7 on the back of all the trade that it did with America. I mean, something like 80% of its exports are to America. It really has not really diversified in its partnerships on the economic front. And Trump likes to talk a lot about the kind of US having a trade deficit with Canada, essentially meaning this imbalance has contributed to the loss of American jobs and harmed their economic interests.
So we've got this hokey-cokey on threats of tariffs going over the border. We've got this war of words, at least coming from Donald Trump, aimed at Canada. But interestingly, while all of this has been going on, there's been a lot happening in Canadian politics. It has very much been in flux. Justin Trudeau has ended quite a long stint in office as Prime Minister. How and why did that come to an end?
So Trudeau, who was in power for nearly 10 years by the end, he was seeing record low approval ratings. Canadians were complaining that he never delivered this Canadian dream that they promised, the rise of immigration. They became the world's most welcoming country during the refugee crisis. They complained about the cost of the weekly shop, unaffordable housing, carbon tax. I mean, Trudeau, by the end, was coming under such immense pressure from his party to step aside, and they didn't see a way to win an election with him at the top of the ticket. And so in steps this Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre. He's essentially a populist. He's described as a Trump light figure. He apes a lot of the MAGA talking points about migrants and fracking. His language is actually kind of unfamiliar to, the Canada polite that's kind of dominated politics for decades there.
Immigration is out of control after 9 years of Liberal policies. They increased population growth by 200% over the last several years alone. Now, Trudeau called anyone who disagreed with these radical policies racist.
And then you suddenly see Trump launch this trade war, and Trudeau starts finally asserting himself. I mean, I think in one of the speeches he gave announcing retaliatory tariffs, he addressed him in first person and he gave him a real dressing down. And a friend of mine in Canada said, "Where is this Trudeau all this time?"
Now I want to speak directly to one specific American. Donald. In the over 8 years you and I have worked together, we've done big things. And now we should be working together to ensure even greater prosperity for North Americans in a very uncertain and challenging world. Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal, but Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do.
What essentially happened in reaction to that is the voters did a sort of rallying around the flag, and Canadians are viewing Poilievre as a kind of poor imitation. The surveys are showing that they don't trust him to stand up to Trump as much as they do a figure like Carney.
Yes. So if we've had the Liberal Party with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tanking in the polls, people going off Trudeau, realising he's sort of all skirts and no knickers in terms of some of the promises that he's, delivered over the years. Then we have this argument with the United States, and all of a sudden the Liberal Party starts to pick up again, and it doesn't look so likely that the Conservative Party might win the next election. But you mentioned there that obviously now the Liberal Party has a new leader, and therefore Canada has a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney.
My government will put into action our plan to build a stronger economy, to create new trading relationships with reliable trading partners, and to secure our borders. There's someone who's trying to do the opposite. There's someone who's trying to weaken our economy. Yeah, Donald Trump. Donald Trump.
People here might have heard that name. He was once governor of the Bank of England. Where is he from, and how has he ended up in that position?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he made millions as a former investment banker at Goldman Sachs, and he's kind of risen through the Canadian civil service. His last role was as climate envoy. But I mean, people here see him as a kind of battle-tested economic titan. So, they see him steering Britain through Brexit as the Bank of England governor. They see him doing the same for Canada through the 2008 financial crisis. I think the benefits that he has is that he hasn't been tarnished by the Liberal Party name and by Trudeau's deep unpopularity by being a member of his cabinet like his rival Chrystia Freeland was. On the other side, he has no political experience, which would ordinarily be disqualifying for the leader of a party, but it's now considered a boon. I mean, when you think about who is in power in their southern neighbour, it's Donald Trump, a businessman who previously had no political experience, that kind of only deals with deals. So they see him essentially now as the only person that could probably take on Donald Trump.
So Mark Carney is sort of this clean sheet, has an offer of stability about him, and also is attached to a party which has been in power but is doing a lot better in the polls thanks to the argument that they're having with their southern neighbour.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at it purely on the figures, the Conservatives had been soaring 25 points ahead for weeks at the end of Trudeau's term. And then the tariff wars kind of helped the Liberals claw back their lead, and the pundits called it a Trump bump. Carney was still trailing somewhat behind Poilievre, but now the parties have them in a dead heat.
And you mentioned how Justin Trudeau somewhat got his mojo back when this trade war and cross-argument with the United States got going. Has Mark Carney carried on with that? Has he been equally forthright in terms of how he addresses Donald Trump?
I think it's still so early to tell, but I mean, we can definitely see that Carney acknowledges and is trying to rise to meet the moment. So he's come out, initially as very strong and uncompromising, talking about how Canada never will become part of America in any shape or form.
Canada never, ever will be part of America in any way, shape, or form. The Canadian government has rightly retaliated and is rightly retaliating with our own tariffs that will have maximum impact in the United States and minimum impact here in Canada. My government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect. We didn't ask for this fight, but Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans, they should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win.
He's already making digs at Trump, saying in Paris on Sunday, it's more important than ever that Canada reinforces its ties with our reliable allies like France, adding, we know that economic collaboration, not confrontation, is the way to build strong economies. So he's definitely kind of, from the get-go, setting out a position that perhaps Trudeau wasn't always very clear on. So Carney now has the task to reset relations with Trump and secure his country's independence, something that Canadians should be able to take for granted, but has now become an existential question. What we will have to wonder now is, how does he do this?
Josie, you've been explaining for us the deterioration of US-Canadian relations and how this has hilariously come at a time of political flux in Canada. We've now got a new Canadian Prime Minister who has this almighty challenge to try and, as you said, reset relations with the US and this quite tricky president south of the border. What is Mark Carney, the new Canadian Prime Minister's strategy on this? Do we know?
So I think a huge part of it is to look at its alliances. And Carney's already made an early statement by choosing Europe, Paris followed by London for his first foreign trip this week. Normally it's always America. But also behind the scenes, from what I understand, there is this big push to kind of diversify exports away from America and perhaps looking to Europe and Asia in particular. So I think that will be a huge focus. Something that Canadians never thought they'd have to grapple with, but thinking about a kind of post-America future.
But it must be quite a challenge, because in the same way that when we were having the Brexit debates here, people were saying, well, Europe is our largest trading partner because one of the major factors that influences that is the fact that who's nearest to you, who's on the border. And if you're Canada and you have this enormous border with the United States, more trade with France isn't going to make up for that, is it?
No, and it's very difficult to export things like energy. But things will have to kind of level out with America. Perhaps it won't be at quite the same level of 80% of export to America that it has been. I mean, I do think there are certain things that they just cannot change. If you look at the auto industry, you have the border of Detroit and Michigan and Ontario and Canada, and there are some car parts that actually go across the border up to 7 times before they make it into the final product. So I think there's things that are so intrinsically linked, there's no way going back from it. And I think even Trump realizes, and he's looked at, the markets and how they've been reacting. And I do think that things have to stabilize.
But how much of this is about more than just who Canada trades with and what level of tariffs there are between them? Is this Canadian call, as we saw via the Canadian Foreign Minister before Mark Carney took over, calling on the likes of the UK Prime Minister to come to their aid, make the argument with them?
We want to be closer to the UK, like we did throughout our history. We want to be closer to Europe.
Is this European liberals, Canadian liberals trying to stem the flow of this revolution that is coming through the United States?
I think there's a tendency to see what Trump is doing as rather random and without a clear end goal. But I don't think that's right. So I spoke to Michael Ignatieff, the former Liberal Party leader. The way he sees it, Trump wants to use these tariffs to bring about a kind of North American economy more firmly under US control. So, he and some others believe Trump eventually wants this sort of borderless continental integration with Canada and Mexico. You add in the Panama Canal question, you add in Greenland into the equation. What it is an expansion of the America's sphere of influence. Essentially, this sphere becomes big enough to really take on countries like Russia and China and determine the global order for perhaps the next century.
And that kind of comes down to the question then of what does Donald Trump want? And is it that he's threatening that you outlined there, all these countries around him becoming either subsumed into the United States or supplicant to it, or he's using it as a negotiating tactic, going so far over the line to shock the likes of Canada into slightly better terms of trade than the US enjoyed with them previously?
I think in his fever dream, he would love that. He'd love a borderless continental integration with the whole of the continent from the north to the south hemisphere, and to kind of be in a position where if there were to be a war or an economic war with China or Russia, that they'd be really strongly positioned. And the idea of Trump being king of this kind of fiefdom is very appealing to him. Even Canadians are starting to take this very seriously. But as you say, kind of, if we have to look at within a one-term presidency, is this possible? Is this likely? Perhaps not. He thinks he'll get a better trade deal for his country. It will help the American economy. We've seen no signs of that in the short term. And also what the danger is now that everyone kind of turns away from the US alliance and starts to make its own friends. I mean, if you think about Big Bully in the playground, are they going to keep coming back and hoping the bully is going to be their friend and be nice to them that day? Or are they just going to go and try and make friends with a kind of more stable, reasonable people in the playground?
And if we are moving into this world where it's not necessarily about shared values who you team up with, and it is quite blunt and mercantilist and who is the biggest person who I can do a big deal with, can even Canada, the UK, France, Germany team up into something which amounts to something that could properly push the US around or not? I mean, even that kind of alliance might pale in comparison.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, to kind of get an idea of their thinking, I mean, I met with a Trump official he has ambassador level status in the government. He said to me at the end of the interview, he was just like, why did Britain give up the Commonwealth? Why do they not still control India and Canada? And he was asking it to me as a serious question, like it was just the biggest mistake Britain had made in the last century. And I just sort of, I was wordless. I didn't know what to say. I just kind of thought, okay, I don't know how to be answering a question about why Britain gave up the Commonwealth. It was just after all the Putin, Ukraine stuff, and Trump had just spoken to Putin for the first time, and when we were talking. And he just said there is an establishing world order. I mean, Europe, even as an entire continent, just doesn't bring the same finances and money and deals to the table as other countries do. And I think that's a large part about it, is that they see Europe as a deadweight albatross around its neck.
Fascinating. Josie, thank you so much. That was so interesting.
Thank you very much.
Josie Ensor, US correspondent for The Times. All of her fantastic reporting and that of the whole Times contingent out there in the US is at thetimes.com, and you can read it with a subscription. That is it from us today. Our producers were Edith Rousselot and Olivia Case. The executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.